WorkSafe is the primary regulator. Its role also encompasses public safety where this is affected by work. The primary duty of care is held by the person conducting a business or undertaking, and they, usually an organisation, are required to manage the health and safety risks to people, including workers and public, arising from their activities. Tour operators, cruise ship companies, emergency responders and landowners fall under this. WorkSafe can prosecute for breaches of the Act, and penalties and criminal sanctions range from $50,000 to $3 million and up to 5 years in prison. I understand the WorkSafe investigation may take a year. The coronial processes are also likely to continue for some time. As a Cabinet, we know that it's possible there will be broader issues that won't be covered by these inquiries. Therefore, I have asked for advice from officials to look into whether there are any gaps that need to be addressed that fall outside of a potential coronial inquiry and the WorkSafe investigation. I expect advice on this in the new year. I can also confirm that today Cabinet approved a $5 million fund for the impact of recent events both in Whakatane and Westland. Particularly, this fund will focus on small businesses who may have been adversely affected. Obviously, we have criteria that's been established for past events that may have had similar effects on small businesses. Criteria will be established, drawing on experience of the past, and a delegated group of ministers will work through that criteria and administration of the fund over the summer period. We don't see this necessarily being the totality of the need in both of these areas, but we thought important to make sure that we were working to address immediate needs in Whakatane, but also in Westland. In terms of the week ahead, Parliament's final sitting day will be on Wednesday, and I will be in the House for question time and the adjournment debate. On Tuesday, I will be in Mahia for the closing ceremony of Tuia 250, in attendance alongside Minister Davis. For now, though, I am happy to take any questions that you might have.
Prime Minister, that $5 million, would White Island Tours or any of the other tour operators at White Island be eligible for some of those funds?
We haven't concluded the establishment of the criteria. What we are acknowledging is that there is likely to be wider impacts on an area, a place that has traditionally relied on tourism for employment and for economic activity. So I'm going to allow MB alongside ministers to work through some of the final criteria. But keeping in mind, obviously, there are a number of employees who have been affected and will be affected by what has happened on Whakaari White Island.
But these tour operators arguably put people at risk in the first place by taking people out there.
Again, pointing out that we haven't concluded the establishment of the criteria or how this distribution of funds will work, except to acknowledge that there will be impacts for Whakatane in the same way we expect impacts in Westland. We've established a contingency which ministers will now work through the criteria around to support those communities.
Prime Minister, in broader terms, under ACC, it's pretty hard to sue people in New Zealand. Do you think this has made it too easy for some businesses to take too many risks and to not face consequences as a result?
No, not at all. Obviously, we have regulatory regimes that are around the management of risk, and particularly health and safety regulations. Those are entirely separate. I simply do not agree that ACC in any way has led to there being less focus on health and safety issues. Obviously here we need to work through a process, and WorkSafe will, around exactly what has happened in this case, and we need to await that work to be done.
Some of these operators and entities could waiting on.
I'll come to you in a minute, Toby.
In terms of that advice that you're waiting for in the new year about any further investigations, do you envisage that it could go as far as a royal commission?
Not necessarily. In fact, keeping in mind, obviously what WorkSafe are able to do can be reasonably comprehensive, and also potential coronial inquests equally. Having looked back over some of the accidents previously in New Zealand, the 2008 canyon disaster, for instance, we had a parachuting incident in Fox Glacier. In both those cases, you saw the then Department of Labour, who held responsibility in that time, or Transport Accident Investigation Commission investigate alongside coronial inquests. So we haven't always had separate inquiries again. What I want to ensure is that we answer all the questions that need to be answered, to try and do that with as little duplication as possible. But I'm waiting for a bit more advice on that.
Does a public inquiry seem like the best method to achieve that?
No, again, having looked at a number of accidents, significant events in recent years in New Zealand, they've often been investigated by, for instance, the Department of Labour, coronial inquests. They haven't always had then separate inquiries. What I want to make sure is that we answer all of the questions we need to answer, that we don't duplicate, and importantly, we don't get in the way of what WorkSafe needs to do as part of their job. So really, I am awaiting that advice. I want to make sure we're properly considered here.
Just to be clear, some of these operators, entities and individuals could be simultaneously investigated by WorkSafe while receiving government funds?
No, I have not said that. I've said we're yet to work through that. What we've decided as a Cabinet today is that there will be undeniably impacts on Whakatane and on Westland as a result of Westland recent weather events and the eruption in Whakatane. We need to make sure we're prepared to support particularly small businesses who will experience knock-on effects from that. We are prepared for that. Now ministers will go away and do the work around criteria.
Include some of the small businesses who will also be simultaneously investigated by WorkSafe.
Again, I have not confirmed that. What I'm saying is that we're prepared to provide the support required. There'll be a number of businesses that will be affected here. I'm going to let ministers now go away and work up, off the back of Kaikoura, for instance, the kind of support packages that we need.
But you're not ruling it out either,
because we've made no decisions. So again, I'm going to leave that to ministers to do that work. Again, there are a number of employees and situations here that need to be thought about too, but again, no decisions have been made. We do need to move with some reasonable pace to get that in order and provide certainty, though, for those businesses more broadly affected.
Given that WorkSafe has the oversight when it comes to volcanic tourism,
yes,
is it likely, I mean, they're obviously running their own investigations, but surely there's going to have to be something much wider that actually takes in a look at what WorkSafe's role and responsibilities were and actually properly look at their sort of role during it all. Would that be fair?
Yeah, and obviously that's not something that necessarily WorkSafe, obviously WorkSafe can't do that. But it wouldn't be out of the question, for instance, for a coronial inquest to potentially do that. So that's, you can understand why I just want to make sure that we get some proper considered advice, look at all of the issues that we rightly expect to be dealt with here, and make a considered judgment in the new year.
Timeframes. What would be the timeframe to actually get that set up, make that decision? And is a timeframe, which you mentioned before, of up to a year for this investigation, is that acceptable to you?
Yeah, so obviously WorkSafe already have announced that they'll be undertaking, as you would expect, a full investigation. They have a 12-month period by which, if they are going to, they would need to pursue any charges if they determine that that's necessary. So there's already a time limit set for WorkSafe. I've been advised that it is likely to take them a year to undertake this investigation. Look, as we've seen, inquiries can sometimes take more than that time. So it's not for me to judge whether or not that's an appropriate time frame. They need to do their job properly and it needs to be properly considered. In terms of the other work, it's up to the coroner as to whether or not they undertake the nature of their investigatory work. That is a matter for them. And for us, as I said, I expect to get some more formal advice in the new year around any potential gaps that we might need to fill.
Wait until that WorkSafe investigation is completed, until the public inquiry or whatever other kind of...
Not necessarily. If we do determine that there are gaps, then that may well be something that we could move on beforehand. I do want to get some advice, though, particularly from Crown Law, as to whether or not that jeopardises the work of WorkSafe and or how we might be able to manage if we do make a decision that is required. So, again, There is already an investigation underway. That's critically important. That has started, has been announced by WorkSafe. Now it's just a question of what might we need to look at to make sure that we look at every angle of what has happened here.
The $5 million be freed up to those small businesses who have been affected?
Well, obviously we made a decision today to enable further work to be done before Cabinet resumes in the new year. So that $5 million is available now for ministers that we've delegated to go and work up some of that criteria over the summer period. So they're free to do that without Cabinet having to come back to it.
This is those?
So we've included Minister Twyford from Economic Development, Minister Robertson, our Minister for Tourism, Kelvin Davis. Minister Mahuta obviously has a role from a local authority perspective. Minister Henare will be involved from a civil defence perspective as well. I think that's yes, I believe that's a complete list.
Would you expect tours to resume to Whakaari White Island before those investigations reported back?
Look, that's ultimately not a decision for me. That is something that, as I understand, would primarily sit with a determination from WorkSafe, so I'll leave them to make that determination.
Presumably they wouldn't be able to make that, or could they make that ruling before ruling?
My understanding is that twofold actually, that there exists provision from a civil defence perspective, and that also WorkSafe, as I understand, from within their health and safety remit, if there is an imminent threat, then they have that provision as well. But ultimately, those are judgments that don't sit with me.
Prime Minister Scott Morrison today tweeted that the tragedy has so far claimed 19 lives. The death toll stands at 16. 2 people remain unaccounted for. Do you have information about a 19th victim?
No. My understanding is as you've set out.
Why this misleading information is ending up in the
Oh,
sphere?
look, I'm not going to make any judgment there because obviously we have a scenario here where we obviously have 2 individuals missing. There have been medivacs where people have then very sadly passed in Australia. Look, I'm making no judgment there around what's occurred. But ultimately, we've tried to keep that information flow going as well, and we'll try to keep doing so.
Discussed with Foreign Minister Payne today, will there be any requests of support for either way?
Oh, look, as I think I've probably said before, the contact between Prime Minister Morrison and I has been frequent, multiple phone calls, multiple messages, giving updates where I can, and likewise PM Morrison discussing what he believes might be occurring on their side. And a focus there for a time around being able to make sure that loved ones are in close proximity to one another, and the Medivac, that is a very resource-intensive operation, of course, providing the flights themselves, multiple health professionals for every single individual patient. So that was an enormous undertaking from Australia where we worked in partnership together and has been now almost entirely completed, as I understand. So there's been good cooperation.
Silence was obviously observed today. Have there been any discussions around I guess a memorial event in coming weeks or months?
There have been discussions. One thing we're very mindful of course, Ngāti Awa have played an incredible role working alongside the families of the victims, not just from within Whakatane, but those internationally too. And it was one of the things that some of those families from abroad really raised as being something that had particularly stood out to them as being unique, and they saw it as being important as well. So really working alongside Ngāti Awa, my understanding is at this stage that there's a desire, of course, to wait for families to be reunited with their loved ones. That will take some time, but I don't expect we'll have a memorial as a result any time soon.
Have you personally been to White Island?
Sorry?
Have you personally been to White Island?
No, I have not. But I've had family members who have.
Do you anticipate, as part of any of those future investigations, inquiries, that you might take a wider look at tourism as a whole? If you think about places like Tongariro, Franz Joseph, these are places that could be quite dangerous at times.
There was, Look, there was work done under the last government around adventure tourism, and so that was fairly recent. I think it's likely that if there are particular issues relating to that regime, that that may well be covered by some of the work that's already underway. But keeping in mind, it wasn't that long ago that work, more wider work was done. Obviously here, we have some very particular circumstances that are unique to volcanic activity. And so there may well be wider learnings, but as I have had it explained to me, there are also different regimes that have applied to Whakari White Island versus others. Again, that may well be something that is discussed in some greater detail as a result of any inquiry work that's undertaken.
Is one of the big problems there the fact that the island's privately owned? Does that complicate the responsibilities and who's responsible for that?
I wouldn't want to make an assertion about that until that work is undertaken, but I think there are some differences around the level. DOC obviously is involved in other volcanoes. That doesn't necessarily point to White Island being specific because of private ownership, but it may point to some differences because of DOC governance. Again, I've always been really careful in all of this not to predetermine or make any assumptions here. I do think it's important that we allow the work to be done properly and just not to get ahead of that, particularly given the scale of this incident.
Are there any concerns?
And the emergency services response to Whakari, will that be covered in either the WorkSafe investigation or the coronial inquest?
No, in the same way that actually in the immediate aftermath, the response to the incident itself, if you take March 15 for instance, that wasn't necessarily covered by any work that was done in the aftermath, but it was something that was looked at specifically by, for instance, the New Zealand Police. I've had a preliminary conversation with officials just this morning around making sure that we do reflect back on what happened in those moments after and the emergency response, because involved in that was everyone from our emergency management teams, the New Zealand Police, first responders like St John's and even Coast Guard were involved. And then there was the role of those who privately operated helicopters. I do think that we need to look at that immediate aftermath, and I do think we owe it to the families to look at that immediate aftermath. And I'm looking for other ways to pursue that. And the police have done a fine job in the past of being involved in that, but those conversations are ongoing.
One of the questions that remains unanswered that we would need to look at an inquiry?
No, not necessarily. We didn't for the 15th of March. Looking at an emergency response, I think, is a very separate piece of work that actually you can move on fairly quickly. So I've raised today questions around the police doing that, being involved in that, and again, our emergency management team. So I don't think that does something that has to be delayed. I do think we can probably get on with that fairly promptly.
Are there any concerns about the ongoing load that's being imposed on the medical facilities? And is there any suggestion that there may be some external help needed?
Look, actually, I've visited Christchurch Hospital in particular, managed to have a conversation with some of the staff there. That medevac of a number of Australian victims so that they could be reunited not only with their loved ones who were in other hospitals in New Zealand, because as you can imagine, once they came to Whakatane Hospital, it wasn't always possible to identify those who were either travelling together or related, and so in some cases they were moved to different hospitals. The medevac process has allowed them to be reunited in one go and also put them closer to their loved ones. That has considerably reduced down the number in critical care in New Zealand. My understanding is that we have 2 in Christchurch, 2 in the Hut, 2 in Waikato, and 8 in Middlemore. So actually the fact that they're dispersed means that has taken the pressure off. There has been some impact, I think, in the short term, and I do want to personally check in on Middlemore, but otherwise I hear that our services are coping very well.
Is it appropriate to be working with Ngāti Awa on a memorial when they could potentially be under investigation as owner of White Island Tours?
In the same way that Ngāti Awa provided and facilitated a role for the deceased who returned on Friday, in the same way that they've provided their marae facilities, the same way that they provided a place for people to gather for the minute silence. I think it is important to remember that regardless of their commercial interests, they are local iwi, and they have been providing a very important role locally.
Is it highly likely that there won't be a further overarching inquiry at all?
No, I don't want to predetermine that. As I say, I am still waiting for some official advice, but just looking across at some different incidents we've had, that tells me that actually we have in the past had coronial inquests and Department of Labour, now WorkSafe, able to look thoroughly into these incidents or tragedies of this nature. But again, I do want to be assured myself by getting that advice in the new year as to whether or not there's further work that won't be picked up by them that we need to look at.
So those two agencies can investigate those two things, and there can be a separate sort of independent look at the first response. Then what are the questions that still need to be answered in your mind?
Some have been raised around whether or not, of course, WorkSafe will be looking at the regulatory framework they're operating in. So did the operators fulfil the expectations around health and safety audits and so on? The question may well be, was that regime itself adequate, and did WorkSafe do their job? Of course, WorkSafe can't look at that themselves, so I just want to get a bit more advice on that.
You indicated on the AM show that there absolutely would be an inquiry. Are you still sticking to that?
Oh, as I said, WorkSafe are undertaking these, and coronial inquests are considered to be of that nature as well. The question is for me whether or not we need a third.
On Friday, you said that you texted Boris Johnson to say congratulations for his election victory. What was his reply to that text?
I haven't received a reply, but we have been working on a phone call. So, and nor would I expect in the immediate aftermath of a busy election. Equally, I'd only heard from him 3 days prior.
When's your phone call going to be, and what are you going to discuss?
Look, it's sometime in the near future, I imagine, but I won't put an exact timeline on that for someone who's just being elected Prime Minister. I imagine very much, well, for me anyway, I will first and foremost acknowledge the fact that UK citizens have been caught up in the tragedy of White Island. Secondly, of course, congratulating him on his election result. And thirdly, of course, our joint FTA aspirations and further plans around Brexit.
Calling him a gaff man back in a 2012 tweet?
Well, clearly I was wrong, wasn't I? Because in that same tweet, it was speculating whether or not he would be Prime Minister. To be fair, I would not have speculated that I myself at that time would become Prime Minister.
So why were you so incredulous?
Again, I've been proven wrong. And from what I know of PM Johnson, I imagine we'd both have a bit of a laugh about it.
Are there any lessons for you from what happened to the British Labour Party?
And we've built our support from the public since then. So I'm not sure that necessarily you can uniformly compare the position of every Labour Party around the world.
Is there a warning there about getting too far away from the base? No?
Well, again, it depends whether or not that's what you're accusing us of, Richard. Oh, right. Well, again, that's something that I tend to leave for other commentators. I think it's enough to run your own party rather than making judgment on anyone else's handling of their own.
Last time you contacted Jeremy Corbyn?
To be honest, I've met Jeremy Corbyn once. You tend to form ongoing relationships with leaders and party leaders that you have relatively frequent contact with, but I just haven't had those opportunities with Jeremy Corbyn.
Your commiserations?
Sorry,
would you send him your commiserations as a fellow Labour leader?
Look, I haven't done that as a general rule of thumb for every progressive person who's been unsuccessful in elections, so that's not something I've generally done. If I knew someone reasonably, then I may well. But again, it just depends on the relationship.
Why were you so incredulous at the prospect of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister?
That's not how I would actually describe that tweet.
Boris Johnson as a possible candidate to be...
Emphasis the reader's own. Again, keeping in mind, this was several years ago, and as I've said, I've been proven wrong.
Discuss a deal for the land of Ihumātao today?
Look, we've had, obviously, since July, a range of discussions amongst Cabinet colleagues, and I would describe talks there as being a work in progress, as being positive. But again, we're not at a point for announcements to be made, but we are making some positive progress.
A resolution before Christmas?
Again, we're not at a point to make announcements, but progress has been positive and ongoing. And as soon as we're in a position to make announcements, of course, we will. But that's not today.
If Auckland Council's made a decision at all about what they would like to happen with it?
Again, conversations have been ongoing with all parties that have an interest. Of course, that includes King, Mana Whenua, Fletchers, and of course local government in the form of Auckland Council. They have an interest because Heritage New Zealand is proposing lifting the status of that land, and ultimately it will then come on council to make sure that's upheld in their unitary plan. So they have an interest now too.
Make a decision on the table for resolving it.
I'll just come to
Did Cabinet make a decision on any of the public media work before it currently?
As Minister Whakatane has indicated, we've had a preliminary discussion as a Cabinet. Further announcements down the track, I'll leave to Minister Whakatane, but I think it's fair to say we all agree that we need to make sure that we're bolstering public broadcasting in the current environment. But we've had that preliminary discussion and it will be ongoing.
Merger, did that come up in Cabinet at all today?
Again, as you'll appreciate, I don't divulge every conversation that's had by Cabinet. I put the emphasis here on the focus and agreement amongst Cabinet around needing to bolster public broadcasting. Ultimately, there are separate processes for things that involved some of the other mergers that have been discussed in the public domain. I'll take it.
Will there still be an announcement on public broadcasting though before the end of the year, as Mr Whakatane had indicated?
He indicated that Cabinet would have discussions, and they have. Again, as I've said, there will be an iterative process.
Be on the same page when it comes
Sorry?
to the government parties broadly on the same page when it comes to public broadcasting?
Yes. Final question.
Cabinet discussed phase 2 of the Reserve Bank Act review?
Again, as you'll recall, I don't divulge every single conversation. Otherwise, we'd go through a probably fairly tedious exercise of ruling things in or out. Ultimately, when announcements are ready to be made in any given area, I allow it up to ministers to undertake that, unless I steal it for myself with post-cab. All right, everyone. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I will allow that final question.
The sexual assault investigation.
We are very keen, of course, to make sure that we complete that process. We have not yet received the report from Maria Dew, and of course that is ultimately up to her to conclude. It was an independent process by QC, so we are still unfortunately awaiting that report. I would hope so, yes, and we will look to move as quickly as we can, but ultimately it still sits with her, and so we are awaiting that in the same way that you are. All right, thanks everyone.